We join me in welcoming Dr. George Mason.
Well, hi everybody. It's great to be back, and thank you for having me back. Two of my favorite churches mostly are here, Wilshire Baptist people and St. Michael and All Angels. So, yay! When you've been around for 30 years in town, you get to know people and churches, and we talk about like sister churches. Some churches, all churches are churches and they're kin in some way, but some siblings are closer than others, So anyway, I think that's true among our churches, our two churches. So thanks very much, and if you're not from one of those churches, welcome anyway. So it looks like all the subjects are difficult that we do this pub theology thing, but last year I had LGBTQ and the church, right? And this year I've got Christians and violence, so nothing to it. There's an old African proverb that goes like this: when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. So violence is like that, right? It's not just the people involved in the violent activity, but it's also the entire community, the whole culture. And when it comes to the question of where Christians stand on violence, you might ask, are we for it or against it? Because historically, not really clear, to be honest with you, right? We are as much the perpetrators of violent activity as we are those who are trying to cure the disease. And so tonight, what I want to suggest to you is that the role of Christians in addressing violence can be a successful and profitable one for the healing of the world. But to do that, we've got to take a hard look not only at the violence that other people do, but at the way Christianity has also contributed to that violence. We need to look at ourselves. And so I'm going to try to do that with you tonight as well. I think it's ironic that we say, for instance, that we follow the Prince of Peace, right? When we Christians are often guilty of doing violence to one another and of defending violence that is done in the world. Just a list of a few ways. I'm not, illuminating you at all here, but consider the current sex abuse scandals in the Catholic Church and in the Southern Baptist Convention. Astonishing to really no one, only that it's been revealed. What about our defense of dehumanizing policies against migrants at the border? What about our support of military strikes and war by Christians before all diplomatic solutions have been exhausted? What about the patriarchal assumptions of our Christian culture that diminishes the equality and full value of women? What about white supremacy that treats non-whites and Jews as if they are less than human? What about the exclusion and judgment of LGBTQ persons in our churches and communities? These are all ways of doing violence to one another. A few facts, not to overwhelm you, although they overwhelm me. Do you understand that trauma is the leading cause of death for people in this country under the age of 45? Do you know that there are 40,000 homicides and suicides in the U.S. annually? Do you know that 1 in 5 women in this country have been sexually assaulted in their lifetime? 1 billion children ages 2 to 17 have been abused physically, sexually, or emotionally in a violent way. 1 in 4 adults has experienced child abuse. A woman is assaulted or beaten in this country every 9 seconds. The presence of guns in a home where there has been a history of domestic violence increases the likelihood of murder by 500%. There are more guns in the United States than there are people. There is one mass shooting, which is defined as 4 or more people killed at one time. One mass shooting per day on average in this country. The 250 years of enslavement of people of African descent and the 100 years or so that followed it with Jim Crow and the terrorizing and the traumatizing of people, black Americans, continues to have deep effects upon our country. The war on drugs and mass incarceration perpetuate violence, especially where there are no attempts at rehabilitation, at restoration, and only about punishment. Hopelessness breeds violence. PTSD is only one of the moral injuries that military personnel who have fought in wars have to deal with. What happens when we are involved in violent activity is that it affects not only those we are fighting, it affects us, and it changes us. Untreated mental illness is a huge part of violence in this country. 50% of people who struggle with addictions suffer also with mental illness, and yet we can't figure out how to provide health care for them on a universal basis. So violence begets violence, and abused people abuse people. What a cycle we're in, right? So this is enough for some people to say that maybe the answer to all of this is we need a little less religion, especially since religion seems to have contributed to the problem, not so much stemmed the problem. And I would suggest to you that what we really need is more good religion and less bad religion. Okay? And that's what we're going to drive toward tonight. Miroslav Volf, who was a teacher to my unofficial research assistant over here, Beth Smith, a friend of mine, he also worked with Moltmann. He teaches at Yale. Volf distinguishes between what he calls thin faith and thick faith. Thin faith is the kind of faith that superficially uses God and faith to defend violence in the interest of its own success. Thick faith is the kind of faith that is more complex, is more nuanced, is more subversive, and requires more thinking, more depth and understanding, and it's the kind of faith that actually, whether it's Christian faith, Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Sikhism, Buddhism, thick expressions of these faiths, one after another, are engaged in the work of combating violence and teaching nonviolence and peace. This is where we're headed. So we're going to talk tonight about Christians and violence, but I want to say Christians are not alone in the religious world in being agents of peacemaking and trying to fight against violence. Do not hear us say tonight that Christians are the answer because you know those Muslims are very violent by nature. You know, or, because frankly, where is all the terrorism in this country coming from? It's almost all white Christian angry males. This is the struggle that we're having. We have to confront our own business. What's going on with us? So this is what we're going to look at. What are the roots of violence? Why do we kill and wound and exclude one another? Well, there's an evolutionary way of answering this, and that is to say that, although we like to think of ourselves as human beings as being, created uniquely and exceptionally from the rest of the animal kingdom, the truth of the matter is, if we're honest about this, we share, Gail, my geneticist friend back here, how much do we share with primates, Gail? 99.5% of our DNA is shared with primates. Chimpanzees, right? Okay, so look, you can call that extra 0.5% unique, and we are, but we should at least be willing to acknowledge that what that means is we are part of an entire ecosystem of creation. And as such, there has been development across time. So if you think in terms of how human beings appear on the face of the earth, we move through this transitionary period where there's an enormous number of pre-Homo sapiens that lived around the world. And what characterizes the difference? It is a kind of birth of consciousness. It is a kind of development of the cerebral cortex. Otherwise, what we're doing is we're operating in what's called the bottom brain, the hypothalamus, where we operate on a survival level altogether. That is, it's all about stimulus response. What does it take for me just to stay alive in this competitive world, right? A dog-eat-dog, red tooth and claw kind of world, right? This is where we came from. But when you make the leap to having a kind of consciousness where you can stand over against yourself and you can, instead of just reacting to pain and threat, instead of just choosing fight or flight, you may actually choose to sacrifice yourself out of care and love for someone else. That's an extraordinary moment of leaping into a humanity that is unlike the animal kingdom for the most part. Generally speaking, evolutionary progress is made in a kind of survival of the fittest approach. Although now, one of the most interesting breakthroughs in evolutionary theory is to see the sociobiology that is learning how cooperation rather than competition is an adaptation for survival that previously we didn't realize. That's a movement that we need to look at carefully. But again, where are the roots of violence? It is in this sense that there's only so much to go around, and you threaten me because you want what I want, so I've got to defend myself or kill or harm or exclude you in order to get what I want so that I can survive. That's a basic way of looking at it. Another theory, René Girard was a French Catholic anthropologist and taught at Stanford for years. Girard made an extraordinary breakthrough in his understanding anthropologically of the roots of violence. Girard said he has basically three key points to make about this. The first is what he calls mimetic rivalry. The second is the scapegoating mechanism, and the third is revelation. So let me try to explain this to you. The idea is that human beings are built with a kind of mirroring instinct. You know how we talk about, when we talk about aping someone, it's about imitation. Well, we know ourselves by looking at other people and by imitating them. One of the imitations is the imitation of what is to be desired. So, for instance, if you have a little child at home, or if you have two children at home, and one is playing with a toy, and the other one says, give me that, I saw it first, right? And the other one says, no, that's mine, I saw it first. No, I saw it first. Well, they both have the same desire for the same toy. That common desire in them shows that they have something that binds them together. But the more it escalates, the more it feeds off of each other, and then they become rivals and competitors, and then the question is, how do they solve their conflict? This is what happens with human beings too, with love. Grey's Anatomy, McDreamy. All the women want him. Why? Because all the women want him. Well, think about it, right? Okay, this is what happens in our culture. Name the circumstance and think about the sale table at the store, right? Why does everyone want that? Is it because they want it or because these people want it too, right? The brand that you wear. Why does everyone want to buy the brand? Because they wear the brand. You know, this is what we do as human beings. It's a way we understand one another in this social order. But when it escalates to the point where it becomes rivalry and then we have conflict, there is violence that has to be done. Now, when that conflict rises to a certain level, then the question is, how are we going to solve this? Well, Cain solved this with Abel by slaying Abel, right? The original act in the Bible of violence that begins the violent stream that happens all through Genesis after that, that unravels the paradise of Eden, right? So that original violent act, what was it? Cain wanted the blessing of approval from God that Abel got. And when he didn't get it, his assumption was if he can do away with his competitor, then he'll be at peace and everything will be back in harmony because now he can deal with his stuff. Because he feels the blessing, he doesn't have a competitor. This is what happens to us. Think about all the examples of this and how it works in our communities, right? Where we, like, what about this woman who was just convicted of hiring a hitman to kill her romantic rival, the woman dentist in Uptown, right? Because she was now dating her former boyfriend. So she's going to do away with this professional woman who was now her rival, and on what? On the logical assumption that then he's coming back to her, right? No, but it is the way, the doing of violence is the way human beings tend to manage their anxiety and their conflict in these ways. Think about gangs in neighborhoods that have a desire for the same territory. They have to kill the other gang members so that they can prove that they have dominance in their community. Think about the Tutsis and the Hutu in Rwanda, who had lived together for years and years and years. But suddenly, a moment came when the community's anxiety had risen to such an extent that then it exploded in a kind of genocidal behavior against their neighbors because of this way of having common desire, this imitative desire that leads to conflict. Think about Jews throughout history. How often have they been scapegoated in communities? How often has it been said that, you know, if we've got problems in our communities because of these outsiders who look different from us, who worship different from us, who one thing after another to justify the violence against them. So this leads to the second thing, and that is the way the community deals with this is in order not to have just everyone killing each other, they develop a scapegoat mechanism. The scapegoat mechanism requires that everyone understand that they can put the blame on one person or one group in order to do away with them so that they can bring peace and harmony back into the social order. And this happened, of course, throughout history in the primitive religions, before Judaism and Christianity and the like. It happened where they would sacrifice human beings to the gods. They would put all the sense of guilt onto one individual and offer this to the gods, usually before a military strike in order to prove their tribal success, or before an agricultural season to make sure that they were blessed by the gods so that they would get a great harvest. So if you offer a human life and put all the sins of the people, the blame, onto this victim, then everyone else will be in solidarity with one another and we're okay. This is the way human beings have dealt with this kind of violence. Now, Judaism comes into the world and develops always in taking what previously was the way the world was organized, and it moves from human sacrifice and says no to that. You know the story of Abraham sacrificing Isaac? That story was not about God telling Abraham to sacrifice his son. It was about teaching Abraham that God doesn't want him to sacrifice his son. Contrary to every other primitive religion, there is this sense of, let's walk through this story so that we see that no, this is not that kind of God. This God will provide the animal. We move from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice. Big improvement in the history of the world, don't you think? Okay. All right. But even after the animal sacrifices become commonplace in Israel, there is a growth and development till the point where they have the scapegoat ritual, which once a year, on the Day of Atonement, the priest would gather the people and would symbolically lay hands on this goat and put all the sins of the people on the goat and then release the goat out of the community into the wilderness, where the goat would be able to take all the sins away from the people and they'd have a sense of release, a solidarity as a people. All the sins are gone, you see. But ultimately, the prophets move to the point where God says to the prophets, and the prophets say to the people, what are your sacrifices to me? You can sacrifice 1,000 rams and goats and all of this, but what I want is justice. What I want you to do is to do justice, to love kindness, to walk humbly with God. In other words, I want you to live differently. I want you to live as the kind of people who love your neighbor as yourself, not who do violence and then want to seek forgiveness. So, in other words, there's a new movement happening here, and this is where Jesus enters the picture. Jesus becomes the scapegoat of the world by God taking the position of the scapegoat, the innocent victim. We'll get to that later. We'll hold that thought for just now. But I want to move on to the ways that Christianity has, instead of following this trajectory, we'll come back to that. I want to show you how Christianity has failed to follow that trajectory, but instead actually preserved the fault of primitive religions and perpetuated violence in the name of God. So the earliest Christians were all nonviolent, for the most part. The first few hundred years of the early church, Christians had no power. They were huddled together in hovels and in people's houses and in catacombs worshiping. They had no power of the state. But after 323, when Constantine made the Christianity the religion of the empire, suddenly Christianity now is in service of the empire and is fundamentally compromised in its sense of loyalties. So, immediately, questions are raised. Should Christians serve in the military? First few hundred years, they weren't even citizens. They didn't have any standing. They were afraid of being persecuted, so they were pacifists, you know. Now, all of a sudden, can we kill people in the name of the Caesar and still be Christians? So Augustine began to develop, in the 4th century, some thoughts about how Christians could serve the empire, could do violence in the name of the emperor, and still be faithful to God, although he was very cautious about delighting in violence. But by the 13th century, when Thomas Aquinas began to reflect upon this, in the midst of the history of the Crusades, where the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire believed that with crosses on their vests and on their shields, they could take their swords, which were shaped like crosses, by the way, right, with the handles and all of that, and they could, in the name of God, conquer the infidels and gain the glory of God in doing so. Aquinas developed for the first time what has come to be known as the just war theory. The just war theory was a way of taking Christians who were knit into the empire in service to it and saying, we need to find some limitations on this violence, some ways to back away from this, because we know we're in shady territory here as Christians. So the first principle of the just war theory is that this can't be about retribution, about vengeance between one person and another. War has to be declared by an authorized ruler or state actor. So therefore, we're going to limit violence. You can't have clan violence, you can't have tribal violence, you can't have individual retribution. The state has to do that. And by the way, that's also one of the reasons why when someone murders someone else and is put on trial, it's not the family of the murdered person who is prosecuting, it's the state, right? So that we're going to limit this kind of retribution. All right, so the second principle is, that's actually the second. The first principle is that it has to be essentially a defensive war. It can't be about an invasion, a preemptive war. It has to be a defensible war and not to acquire wealth or power. So all empire and imperialist means of expanding your power and control and worth are not fit for a just war theory. Third, the war must be fought to promote good or avoid evil with the aim of restoring peace and justice after the war is over. So in other words, the idea here is you only go to war, you only do violence to other people in order to create peace and order. Now, if that sounds a little screwy in its logic, that's usually the way it works out. Okay. Later, these principles were added, and the first is that war should be only a last resort. It should never be a first step, but it should always be only after negotiations and all peaceful solutions have failed. Next, the war should be fought with proportionality, with just enough force to achieve victory, and only against legitimate targets, that is, civilians should be protected. Now, whatever you think about what just happened in the White House about retaliating against Iran, what we just heard was the justification for the president backing down from this was on the basis of this principle of proportionality, because he was told, I don't know why it was so late he was told this, but he was told that there was going to be so much collateral damage to citizens that it was not proportional in its response. And so this principle did save lives in this particular case. So finally, the good which is achieved by war must be greater than the evil that led to war. the easiest thing to think about there is just World War II, the only good war we know, that kind of thing, where it was an effort to stave off this expansionary evil that was genocidal and just horrible. And so the idea is, if we do this, we're preventing greater evil from taking place. Now, for all the promise of the just war theory, there are some problems with it. The first is this: there's no such thing as a just war. There is justifiable war, perhaps, according to this criteria, but not just war, not righteous war. So let's be careful about our words. The second thing is that a just war has pretty much never really been fought. All these principles have been compromised almost every time we've ever gone to war. A third is how distant this is from the way of Jesus. Can you imagine Jesus sitting down on the Mount of Beatitudes in the Sermon on the Mount and saying, "I'd like to give you 6 principles of a just war"? Well, seriously. The other thing is, war by its very nature, just or not just, creates moral injury to combatants. Even if you are the victor, you bear within yourself the marks of that engagement in a way that is deeply hurtful and wounding. Looking at our current situation, it is abhorrent to me that Christians are the Christians who are promoting and encouraging war in our country and around the world are Christians who are deeply compromised by their nationalist ambitions. Those who are supporting a particular political party, those who see America as somehow essentially Christian. So what they are doing is supporting violence and war in order to bring about more glory for their understanding of America, and by that instrumentality for their understanding of their Christian faith. So where do we go? Christians and violence, not Christianity and violence. Let's get to Christians and violence, which is back to the last point of René Girard, and that is revelation. What Girard saw in the Gospels is that the crucifixion of Jesus was the epitome of the scapegoat mechanism that had been practiced since before the foundation of the world. The way the world dealt with violence. Think about what the high priest said at Jesus' crucifixion. It is better for one man to die than for all the people to perish. So scapegoat the one. Now let me stop there and say, before you say, see, the Jews killed Christ. Okay? Look, here's the thing about every one of our religions. It's thin and thick, and it's not always clear when we're doing what. Every one of our religions is growing and wrestling with itself. Nothing ever appeared pure right out of the box. God's been at work in all of our faiths to teach us, and we Christians have many such moments in which we are complicit in violence as well. So let's not give the Jews all the blame for this, because actually the Romans perfected the art of scapegoating. Crucifixion itself was an attempt to do such violence to people in such a public spectacle that they hung the victims out there so that everyone would be intimidated by it and everyone would have this sense of release. We got rid of the bad people. We can now have peace again. This is what happens with lynchings. I just came back from Montgomery, Alabama, and I hope all of you have the opportunity someday to go both to the Equal Justice Initiative Museum in Montgomery and also to the Peace and Justice Memorial, the Lynching Memorial in Montgomery, where these hundreds of recorded I forget how, 2,000, I think, actually, I believe is maybe the number, that they have now recorded the names of in counties all across America. There is a pillar for every county in America where lynchings took place and inscriptions of the names and dates of the lynching. People of African descent, black Americans, were lynched by mob violence in this country during the Jim Crow era, thousands of them, and many of them we don't even know. In Dallas, Texas, in 1910, I believe it was, Alan Brooks was accused of raping a white girl. He was in the Little Red Courthouse on the second floor being processed when a mob grabbed him and threw him out the window, the second story, breaking his legs, and then they dragged him from there to Main and Ackert Street, and they hung him on Main and Ackert, and like 10,000 people showed up to witness this, and there is a picture that appeared in the newspaper and was made into a postcard. And people all over Dallas sent postcards to their friends in America of the lynching of Alan Brooks to say, this is who Dallas is, just sending greetings from Dallas, Texas. Why were all those people there to witness this lynching? It was to put all the guilt and blame on this victim so that we could feel innocent. If all the guilt goes on one, then we feel innocent, and there we go. But think about what we do in church. We sing all these blood hymns, right? Nothing but the blood, there's power in the blood, all this sort of thing. All about Jesus being the sacrifice to appease an angry God who, because of our sin, cannot look upon us, but because of Jesus, he took it all from us so that now we can have peace with God, because otherwise we could not. We needed a perfect sacrifice. Jesus would be the perfect sacrifice. And the idea is founded upon the ancient pre-biblical myths of religious scapegoating. That you have an angry God who needs to be appeased in order for peace to come to the community. And so we have Jesus, the innocent victim, the perfect victim who takes all our sin away. But this is the devil's work. The word Satan means accuser. This is the one, I accuse you of having all the sin on you. See, we separate ourselves from that one, and then we think God will be pleased because we have sacrificed in this way. In fact, what the cross is supposed to do is change our mind about who God is, not change God's mind about who we are. That's the thick Christianity that will undo violence. That's what Girard saw. What Girard saw is the scapegoating mechanism only works as long as everybody buys in and lives in denial and doesn't see the victim as innocent. Everybody has to agree the victim is guilty, this is justified, this is the way this is supposed to work, then we can all feel good. But when we see it, when we see him, and the Roman centurion saw him, didn't he? The Roman centurion saw him and said, surely this is the Son of God. This is the breakthrough in the history of religion. It's the end of the scapegoating mechanism. It's the way we're supposed to now be done with sacrificing others. Instead, the way of Jesus is an alternative way in the world that undoes all of this work, because we now have seen the revelation of its folly and how violence only begets violence. So where do we go from here? We have to sustain communities and churches that practice nonviolence, that teach each other how we will not scapegoat each other. We will bind ourselves to each other in the pain of our experience, and we will work it out together through the gospel way, which means we will not other each other. Do you know what I mean by that? We will not say, you're divorced, you're not like me. You're single, you're not like me. You're gay, you're not like me. You're trans, you're not like me. You're black, you're not like me. You're from another country, you're not like me. Because we have to protect the solidarity of our community, and the way we do that is by creating others, not like us. Instead, we have to learn how to see each other as another like us. In all of our differences, like us nonetheless. And so we have to learn how to make inclusion, not exclusion, the way of Christ in our churches. We also have to learn how to turn enemies into friends. Jesus said a remarkable thing. The Jewish New Testament scholar, Amy Jill Levine, says pretty much everything Jesus said is already somewhere in the rabbis, except this one thing, she said. It never says, love your enemies. Do good to them that hate you. This seems to be a unique Jesus contribution. I'm not sure that she's not going to be disputed by rabbis about that, but the point is Jesus took this question of who is my neighbor, who am I supposed to treat this kindly way, and he drove it past Israel. He drove it past others who are benign toward us. He drove it all the way even toward enemies. Do good to those who hate you. We have to develop a vision of how to live our life from the end to the present instead of the present to the end. So here's just an example. In your greatest imagination, when we all get to heaven, as we like to say, in the new creation, when the new age is inaugurated, when we are living in the kingdom of God, fully present in the world, will we have more guns than people? I mean, is heaven a fortress? Or is heaven the place where we don't need weapons of war to defend ourselves because we have learned how to live together in such a way that we don't want to defeat each other. We don't want to do violence against each other. We are now living as transformed people in the kingdom of God. If that's so, then the question really to us as Christians today is, how do we prepare ourselves for then? And the answer shouldn't be, I think, let's become the kind of people who are armed garrisons, who are protecting ourselves in this life so that we won't have to in the next life. I don't think so. I think this life is a rehearsal for the next. And the question is, how do we bear witness to that way, even if that means we have to drop this sense that we are so worthy of protecting our lives and our property that we will sacrifice somebody else's life to protect it, even if they wish us ill. Even if they wish us ill. Next, we have to learn peacemaking techniques. One of the problems we have is we go straight to violence. We don't know how to communicate with one another, to tone down the rhetoric. We don't know how to dial back the anger because we don't practice it together. There's a fascinating study among schools now that schools that are teaching mindfulness techniques to children at the beginning of a school day find that their conflicts are less. They have fewer kids sent to the principal's office. They have fewer kids who are being expelled for fighting. They are learning how, through these mindfulness techniques, to meditate and to understand that they are valuable as people and how to calm themselves in the midst of conflict. They're doing this in schools with tremendous success. In our churches, we barely know how to pray, let alone meditate. And we want to be entertained with loud music rather than be quiet and listen to the voice of God. Because after all, I mean, if you're too quiet, it makes people nervous, and they probably won't come. And the main thing we want to do in our churches is grow. Have as many people as possible, not necessarily think about what makes for the kind of Christians that can live in the world in this way. So we need to learn from people like Gandhi, as Martin Luther King did, to practice nonviolence. Forgiveness is a way of changing the past. One of the biggest problems with violence is the inability to forget. Do you know that the word in the Greek for truth, aletheia, is actually the word that means not to not forget, which is to not forget the right things rather than to forget the wrong things. So that the point is, we have to learn not to nourish the memory of pain and injury, but instead to pay most attention to the memory of blessing and goodness. This was a problem in the Balkan War when the Serbs and the Croats went at each other back in the 90s, right? Well, the whole conflict stemmed from the nurturing of a grievance that happened in the field of blackbirds, which happened in like 600 years ago. It was like it was yesterday in their culture, right? Because they hadn't learned to let go of the wrong things and to hold on to the right things. So finally, let me just say this quotation from Martin Luther King Jr. He says this: "The nonviolent approach does not immediately change the heart of the oppressor. It first does something to the hearts and souls of those who are committed to it. It gives them new self-respect. It calls up resources of strength and courage that they did not know they had. Finally, it reaches the opponent and so stirs his conscience that reconciliation becomes a reality." That's where we're going. Okay. Thanks very much. Do you see how many questions I have here? Is time up yet? So here's the thing, you all are asking these questions and spoiling a perfectly logical address that I just gave with all your practical questions against my idealism, Well, let's be honest. Applying these things is where it gets hard, especially with this subject, right? So just, I tried to organize them, but I was pretty unsuccessful in doing so because they're kind of all over the place. Anyway, let me try to just move through quickly and see if I can remember when there were similar ones, that sort of thing. So the first question had to do with a misunderstanding of what I said, I think, because the question was why there would be more guns than people in heaven. Heaven's supposed to be a place of peace. You've made my point. Okay. Actually, I don't believe there will be guns in heaven because we don't need them. But someone else actually made an interesting point and said, I raised the average for more guns than people because of how many I have in my home, given that I am a hunter and that sort of thing. And so it's about sport. And so basically, am I a bad person, according to you, is what that means. My answer to that is that the majority of people, according to surveys, say they purchase guns for self-defense, not for hunting. If all we did was to have guns for people who were hunters, that would be a completely different story about what we're dealing with. But that's not actually what the majority of people say is their primary reason for purchasing guns. So if we could get into a long philosophical discussion about that, but I think the more important question is protection against whom and why and for what purpose. And then that gets into a lot of questions, I think, really about this idea of what does our life consist of that we are protecting. So for myself as a Christian, everything I have in my house you are welcome to plunder so that I don't have to have a gun to defend it. I would rather you take everything I have than have a gun to stave you off. I'm just saying for me. I'm not saying that for everyone else. The next question, though, is, but what about my children and my wife and all of that? And this is one of the classic questions. If someone breaks in and you do that, wouldn't you want to protect your wife and kids and family? Of course I would. And the first thing I would want to do is to sacrifice myself, and I hope I would do that. I hope I would stand between them and the gunman. Oh, thank you for that. I hope I would do that. But I think this is what families need to have a conversation about. I think we need to talk about what is our life, and if we are going to be part of the consciousness of self-defense against others for the sake of protecting our lives and escalating the justifiability of violence, castle doctrines and all of that, I'm not in for that. I'm not in for that. I'm not saying everybody is wrong who doesn't agree with me. I'm saying I'm not. And I think we have to have that kind of conversation. There are too many times the castle doctrine, you know what the castle doctrine is? That is, I'm the king of my castle, you try to break in, I'm justified in shooting you if you break into my house. And do you know how many wrongful deaths have been incurred by people who have shot in supposed intruders, and they've shot family members, and they've shot neighbors, and they've shot all sorts of people? Look, this whole notion of self-protection is part of this culture of valuing my life much more than anybody else's life. I can't control everybody else's violence. I can control my need to protect my own life. Look, I actually believe in resurrection. I believe that God is just. I believe that there's more life to come on the other side. And I don't think that my primary duty is to live as long as I can at the expense of everyone else. So for me personally, I can't tell you I'm legislating this for everyone else. I just want to challenge the assumption and say, if I die in a conflict like that, I'm good. I'm okay. And you may not feel the same way, but you've asked me tonight. So that's fine. Is self-defense just? So there were several questions similar to that, including war and all of that. And again, I want to reiterate, look, this sounds like semantics. I don't think violence is ever just. You may argue that it is justifiable based upon the criteria that you set up about, that you're limiting violence by doing this lesser violence, those sorts of things. I understand that, but there's a difference between saying it can be justifiable according to the logic or reason that you develop around that. But when you start saying it is just, now you are sacralizing violence in a way that says it can be righteous, it can be religious, it can be pleasing to God. I can't go there with you. Okay. I can't go there with you. Are there times when, like several questions were, would you kill Hitler? And obviously, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who's one of the, sort of modern saints of the church, determined that that was a moral position for a Christian to take, and he became part of the plot to assassinate Hitler, and he was discovered for it and was hanged. And my answer to that is that, again, that may be the decision that you make on the basis of a justifiable cause to say we're saving a lot of other people's lives. All I'm saying is it's not done in the name of Christ. It's not done. It cannot be done in a Christian theology that says we can justify violence in the name of Christ by killing other people. A lot of times we might have to do things in what we might call a fallen world, that is, in a sinful world. My new friend here just from Waco told me that she sort of stopped reading theology with Reinhold Niebuhr, but he was sort of the person who essentially talked about trying to be a moral person in an immoral world, and that sometimes the realism that you have to deal with is you make the best decision you can, knowing that there are no good outcomes in this, that you're making the better of the worst outcomes. I still would say to you, be careful about enlisting Jesus in your cause. He didn't do it, okay? Jesus said, put away the sword. If you live by the sword, you die by the sword. And when it came time to defend himself, he didn't. And he went to the cross. So then, when we decide, that was good for him, thank you for all the benefits we received from that, we're actually going to go back to living otherwise. All I'm saying is, don't use Jesus and enlist him in your way of life when he called you to something else. That's my point. Not that everyone who serves in the military is wrong. Every time we defend the defenseless against an oppressor, it's wrong. Just that doing violence in Jesus' name is always dubious. Always. Okay? Standing up for the oppressed is not. Standing up for the oppressed is the right thing to do. So one of the questions has to do with, well, how do we act on behalf of those who are having violence done against them? And I think the answer to that is we put our own lives at stake. We defend them. We stand with them. We use, and this is, in this room, I mean, really, in this room, we have an enormous amount of privilege. We have more power to influence people in this room and change the culture of Dallas than just about any room I'm ever in Dallas. You know people. You influence people. So yeah, the average annual murder rate, one of the questions said, in Dallas is 30. It's 101 right now. Something's happening in Dallas. So the question is, what are we going to do about that? And all I'm suggesting is we do have many creative ways for us to be a participant in that. We know, for instance, that hopelessness and poverty and mental health, these sorts of things, education, these sorts of things are crippling our communities. And when we choose to self-segregate, live only among people who are like us, send our kids to privileged schools, fight against higher taxes that support schools in our community where they have a right to have an education just as much as we do, when we continue to support policies that privilege us and underprivilege other people who are part of the same public, children created in the image and likeness of God, just like us, people for whom Christ died, just like us, people who are our neighbor that we are commanded to love by Jesus, when we continue to practice things that privilege us and underprivilege others, that's not standing up for them. That is promoting a culture of violence and hopelessness that will yield more murders, more crime, more of all that sort of thing. The answer to how to get to peace is not to elect people who will say, we need a different tone in this city. The answer is, how do we get justice in this city? How do we get equity in this city? In 2013, the Urban Institute did a study of 274 cities in America. Dallas, Texas came in 274th in income and opportunity and justice and racial inequality. In all the markers of inequality, this city, which you and I, almost everyone in this room, experiences as prosperous, as a place that we think is happening. There is no greater place in the United States, no greater city in the United States that experiences greater disparity in how you are treated by the police, in how you are treated in the judicial system, in how you are treated on the street, in how you are treated to education and health care. No city in America has greater disparity. Do we wonder why crime would increase? Do we wonder why conflict racially and ethnically would increase? Come on. We can do something about this, but we've got to stop promoting policies that protect us and disadvantage other people. So, anyway, I'm on a high horse about that. So there were several questions about Islam and whether it's a violent religion by its very nature, that sort of thing. And my answer to that is, we have seen Islam being characterized that way since 9/11 and even before it by really ignorant jihadists who have hijacked that religion. And if you know many Muslims, many imams in this community, you would know how it pains them, how they live looking over their shoulder every single day because of these nutcases that have hijacked their religion. We have the same here in America. I mean, look, once again, I just want to say, why are Muslims not asking Christians, what is wrong with your religion that all these white Christian men keep shooting up schools and synagogues and mosques and all of this? What's that? And courthouses. What in the world is going on with you Christians? But we sort of deflect all that and say, that's just a fringe group. With Islam, we say, well, that's the very nature of that religion. They're just a violent religion. Again, it's the thin or the thick version of any religion. And the thin version is easily co-opted by people for violent purposes. The thick version is the one that takes getting down in the dirt to love your neighbor, and many of our religions are doing just that, even here in Dallas. How do I practice nonviolence in defense of others who are practicing violence? I really think the civil rights era in this country was the most beautiful example of how to do that. So again, I was just in Montgomery. Do you understand that Rosa Parks, when she remained seated on that bus in Montgomery that day, she did not do so on a whim. She had received enormous training in her work with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and that training was careful training about how to react nonviolently and in order to bring about peaceful change. She was one of the people, she was not the first one, she was the second one who was selected to be a representative that if this situation occurred, she would behave in this way. And she was the one arrested, and thank God she was, because she practiced the techniques of nonviolent resistance that changed people's minds about all of this. That's what we have to learn how to do. We have to learn how to be in the presence of people who would do violence and not accept it. I have a friend here in this room who finally decided that at our country club, when we're sitting around having drinks in the 19th hole or on the golf course, and everybody's promoting a kind of hoo-ha Christianity and politics, he's just not going to be quiet anymore. Look, a lot of us are in these conversations. We know what happens with our neighbors and our family and all of that, where they're just cheering on a kind of politics and religion that is promoting disunity and division and violence in the name of our faith. We can't just give it a pass because we don't want to get into it. We have to stand up nonviolently and lovingly and say, I'm sorry, I don't accept that. Let's talk and reason together about the way of Jesus, about our faith, about the way we live together in the community. We have to figure out how to find each other with dignity and kindness, but truthfulness, and not let this sort of mob mentality, this rally mentality take over our country. And I mean that in both left and right, because we're hitting an election season, and it's nothing but demonizing opponents, either direction. Where is Where is it that we're going to find people who are going to say, I see you, I get what it's like to be a coal miner and to have generationally lost a sense of hopefulness about the next generation. I get what it's like to be a trans person and realize how marginalized you are. I get what it's like to feel like you've worked all your life and you can hardly, figure out how to send your kids to college or something of that nature, or that you've risked everything in your business and you should be able to profit by it. Look, I get all. When are we going to see each other and listen to each other like that? Well, there's a lot of great questions here. I think some of you can answer them, so come and find one and do that later. But Mary has given me the high sign. I'm good for tonight. Thank you so much for having me.